Here's kind of the bigger rundown of using the Tech Bro tools to check the Tech Bro policies. So I used ChatGPT and I just asked it, hey, are all these things added together a genocide plan? So I included Elon Musk's embrace of the Dark Enlightenment. I used JD Vance's obsession with Curtis Yarvin. I included the cuts to Medicaid, the gutting of the federal workforce, taking away benefits from veterans. Apparently, we're going to start closing Social Security offices, dismantling the Department of Education, RFK Jr. talking about putting people with disabilities in work camps and taking away their SSRIs and their ADHD meds. The elimination of drug price negotiations from the Medicare agreements, and then all of the policies of Project 2025. And I literally just asked ChatGPT, hey, is this genocide against the poor, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the LGBTQIA+, and free thinkers? And ChatGPT thought about it for a little while, and this is what they said. The policies and ideological shifts you describe, ranging from cuts to essential social programs like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and veterans benefits, to radical restructuring of government institutions like eliminating the Department of Education and drug price negotiations and gutting the federal workforce, indicate authoritarian-leaning political philosophies specific to Curtis Yarvin and the Dark Enlightenment, RFK Jr.'s remarks on disabled individuals, and Elon Musk's increasing alignment with reactionary thought. These all raise serious concerns about who will bear the brunt of these changes to society and the political structure. While this is not explicitly genocide in the traditional sense, these policies would lead to large-scale suffering, premature deaths, and systemic marginalization of vulnerable populations. Here is an analysis of how these intersecting policies target the poor, the elderly, the disabled, the LGBTQIA individuals, and political dissenters. Whether or not it amounts to intentional social cleansing or population control, at a minimum, it is de facto social cleansing or population control. Here's how targeted groups would be affected. Low-income individuals, cuts to Medicaid, ending drug price negotiations, and destruction of the social safety net will lead to a lack of health care, increased medical bankruptcies, and higher mortality rates. The elderly, cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid would lead to reduction in nursing home funding. This will force seniors into poverty, lose them their medical care, and it results in rising death rates. Disabled individuals, RFK Jr.'s work camp rhetoric, Medicaid and SSDI cuts, and the elimination of disability benefits will lead to a loss of independence, forced institutionalization, and higher mortality rates. Veterans, cuts to VA benefits, Medicaid, and housing programs will lead to increased veteran homelessness, untreated PTSD in the veteran population, and increased suicide in an already crisis situation. LGBTQIA+. Legal rollbacks on protections that we are seeing in multiple states and in Project 2025 policies will lead to health care bans, restrictions on gender-affirming care, and it could also lead to loss of insurance coverage and transfer of wealth to beneficiaries, with states going after the overturn of the right to gay marriage. This will lead to increased discrimination, loss of health care, and violence against LGBTQIA+ community members. Freethinkers and dissidents. The embrace of Curtis Yarvin's authoritarian ideas and Musk's reactionary politics will lead to the criminalization of protests. We already saw that with Trump's tweets or Truth Social posts, I think today or yesterday. This will lead to increased state repression of freedom of expression, loss of free speech, and the loss of civil rights. We already saw Trump disband the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. So currently in the United States, there is no investigation or enforcement for infringements on your civil rights, like hate crimes, except for Christians. He implemented specific protections for Christians in an executive order. So the key takeaway here is the cumulative effect of these policies could result in mass premature deaths, severe human suffering, and systemic exclusion of marginalized persons, and result in a form of structural violence that disproportionately harms those deemed undesirable by the elitist, authoritarian, oligarch agenda. Ideological underpinnings of social Darwinism and the Dark Enlightenment. Many of these policy changes align with reactionary social Darwinism and neo-reactionary ideologies that devalue the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the marginalized, while favoring corporate power and centralized power in an authoritarian ruling class. Curtis Yarvin and the Dark Enlightenment movement argue that democracy is a failure, the world should be ruled by authoritarian corporate elites, and that the weak, poor, disabled, and politically dissenting should be left to die to create a stronger society. Elon Musk and JD Vance have publicly, verbally aligned themselves with these ideologies. Elon Musk is currently wreaking havoc on his way through our democratic government on his path towards achieving this goal of an authoritarian, oligarchical regime. RFK Jr.'s talk of work camps for disabled individuals echoes early 20th century eugenics policies where disabled people were isolated from their families and institutionalized and forced into labor or drugged into comatose states or given lobotomies. This is not just a fiscal issue. Cutting the government is not just about money. It is an ideological shift toward authoritarianism, wealth consolidation, and a form of biopolitical control that removes government support and aid to the undesirable masses. So does this constitute genocide? The United Nations definition of genocide from the 1948 Genocide Convention includes, and I quote, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. While these policies do not fit the strict definition of genocide, they do align with what is called structural genocide or social murder, a system in which policies intentionally or negligently lead to mass suffering and premature death among specific groups. We've seen this in history. From 1845 to 1852, the British government engaged in a pattern of inaction during the Irish potato famine. It led to mass starvation, though they weren't directly killing the Irish. From 1932 to 1933, Stalin engaged in the Soviet Holodomor famine, where policy decisions led to exacerbated mass starvation. And Nazi Germany used its Action T4 program, where individuals who had disabilities were deemed burdens and euthanized. They started this with cutting funding for disabled care before they started moving these individuals to camp and actively exterminating them. A coordinated effort to cut healthcare, remove economic safety nets, criminalize dissent, and strip rights from marginalized groups could lead to large-scale deaths, creating a modern form of passive genocide or genocide by policy. So is this a deliberate plan to eliminate the undesirables from our population? While no leader is explicitly calling for mass extermination, the cumulative impact of these policies is disturbingly close to genocide by policy, a slow, calculated form of social cleansing that disproportionately eliminates the sick, the poor, the disabled, and the politically non-compliant. A few critical things that we should think about. If policies disproportionately lead to mass death, does intent matter? Does it matter if they intend or explicitly say out loud, this is our goal? And the answer is no. Because even if they don't explicitly say, this is our goal, their negligence, their active implementation of these policies in the face of multiple people telling them, you are going to kill people, poor, elderly, disabled. They are going to die from your policies. And you proceed in the face of those warnings? Yes, it is genocide by policy. Why are these cuts primarily targeting the most vulnerable populations? If Elon Musk's actions, moving his way through the government agencies, slashing programs, cutting contracts, and removing funding for social safety net and aid programs, if it was really about economic stability, why are we increasing the debt ceiling? Why are we adding $4.5 trillion to the national debt? And why are we still increasing our defense budget? If we really were in that dire of financial situation, we would be making cuts across the board. And lastly, why is this happening alongside increased authoritarian rhetoric? The embrace of Curtis Yarvin, Musk's reactionary politics, and anti-democratic movements suggests that there is a desire to replace our democracy with a corporate oligarchy, an authoritarian form of government. This makes the poor expendable. So while this may not be an explicit, orchestrated genocide in the traditional sense, it is a systematic push toward authoritarian social engineering. Millions of Americans, particularly poor, disabled, elderly, and marginalized. This may not be an explicit, orchestrated genocide in the traditional sense, but it is a systematic push toward authoritarian social engineering, where millions of Americans, particularly the poor, disabled, elderly, and marginalized, will suffer and die prematurely. Whether this is by design, with intent, or negligence, because they're just selfishly focused on getting the most money and taking government contracts, and they do not care who dies, the outcome is the same. Mass suffering, mass death, and the consolidation of power in the hands of an elite ruling class known as the oligarchs, with Trump as their king.